Okay, so in this video in chapter 4, what we're talking about is various aspects of behavioral economics that, you know, impact people's decision making, right? And so the first thing we're going to talk about is framing effects. And framing effects is basically where you have the same problem, right? So you can think of it as a coin, and you can frame it in two different ways, or at least two different ways. And that changes how people think about it, right? That changes the answer that people give. And so the example we're going to give here is the ability to frame something either as a gain or a loss. Now, in the next video, we're going to be talking about loss aversion. And loss aversion is one of the strongest things to come out of behavioral economics. And what it really means is that people sort of measure their own utility against some reference level, right? And finding that reference level is tricky, but once you have that reference level, then anything less than that is considered a loss and people really don't like it. And anything more of that is considered a gain. And gains seem to behave more or less sort of how we think of traditional utility, right? With sort of a concave utility function. But the problem is that losses behave as kind of a convex utility function. And so from framing, if we can frame something as a gain versus a loss, people will make, different decisions, right? And so here's an example. So there are 600 lives at stake, right? So, imagine a movie where there are 600 people could die. Consider two possible treatments. We have A and B with outcomes listed below. So for treatment A, 200 people will be saved. For treatment B, there's a third chance that 600 people will be saved and 2/3 of a chance that no one will be saved. And so which are you going to choose? And so think about A and B or C and D, right? Now C and D is treatment C is 400 people will die. And treatment D is 1/3 chance that no one will die and a 2/3 chance that 600 people will die. And so now you can see, right, in A and B, we had treatment A was 200 people will be saved. Treatment C was 400 people will die. Well, that's the same thing, right? Because there's only 600 people. For treatment B, a third chance that 600 people will be saved and 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Versus treatment D, where we have a third chance that no one will die and 2/3 of a chance that 600 people will die. Well, again, that's the same thing, right? And so in an experiment, if you just randomly select, you give some people the choice between A and B and some people the choice between C and D, even though A and C are the same and B and D are the same, you get very different outcomes, right? So 72% of the first group, the A and B group, will choose A over B because it's about 200 people being saved. Whereas in the second group, between C and D, 78% choose D over C because there's that chance that you have everybody dying, right? So it's like you don't want the 200 people definitely dying, even though it's really the same. So it's, people being saved is positive, right? That's a gain. People will die is a negative. That's a loss. And so it evokes very different emotions and very different decisions. And people have done this experiment over and over, and they find, very similar results. So, how do we think about that? Well, so Glaser has a paper where he models sort of supply and demand of false beliefs. And the idea here is that if we as consumers have what he calls cognitive vulnerabilities, just meaning, we make mistakes, right, in our thinking, then that is open to manipulation by firms. And firms, if they can cultivate those false beliefs, will send them to consumers, especially if they can profit from them. And consumers are more likely to accept those false beliefs if it makes them happier. And I think, we see this all the time in advertising. We can think of it, very clearly in like political advertising, especially. There are slightly more rules in, product advertising, but we still see it, right? And so we still see that marketers will promote misinformation, especially when it yields a greater return. And so, this is opens up a question of whether or not we should sort of be paternalistic in our regulation of things like advertising, in order to protect consumers from our own false beliefs, which firms will take advantage of. So another piece that is sort of related to framing is this idea of anchoring. And so anchoring is about giving consumers an anchor, a number, a frame of reference, by which they will judge the product, right? And so one example is, you'll often see the MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price. And so the MSRP might be, $100. And then they'll have that $100 crossed off and they'll say, for you, it's only $80. And you're like, oh, okay, well, so this is good. I'm getting a deal. JCPenney kind of took that to the extreme, right? JCPenney's retail strategy was, to say, oh, you're getting bargains all the time. And, they'd have, their clothes, it would say, oh, it was $300 and now it's only $65, right? And $65, I'm getting a huge bargain. And interestingly, when JCPenney tried to change that strategy, right, to have sort of everyday low prices, their sales really cratered, and they basically went out of business. They had to restructure, and they went back to that strategy, right, because what people were looking for at JCPenney was the feeling that they were getting a good deal. Even if they weren't, right? Even if that $300 was just completely made up and it was never even worth $300, they felt like they were getting a good deal. And so anchoring can be really important, and it's really a way to sort of, frame something as a gain, right? So you are gaining big savings in this case. Another example of framing is the default effect, right? And the default effect is basically that whatever is the default is what's often chosen, right? And so we call it status quo bias sometimes. So one example, a couple of important examples here is like whether or not people are organ donors automatically and they have to opt out, or whether or not they are not organ donors and they have to opt in. And you get big differences in how many organ donors you have depending on what is the default. Similarly with 401k contributions, right? So 401k contributions are retirement savings, and you sort of have to sign up when you start a new job. But if the default is that people are signed up automatically and they can say, no, thank you, I don't want to be part of this, or they're not signed up automatically and they have to actively choose, that can make a big difference in how many people participate in 401k contributions, which then, leads to a big difference in people's retirement savings. And then obviously, like with email marketing, whether or not you have to opt out or opt in. And of course, now sometimes it's confusing because half of them seem to be opt-outs and half of them seem to be opt-ins. So you actually have to read it and figure out what you're doing there. So another piece of sort of behavioral economics that's important is the idea of overconfidence. And overconfidence is just a very human natural trait. What we find is that the only people who are usually not overconfident are people who have depression. And so people are, overconfident in their abilities. They are over optimistic in what they can accomplish. We see this, in like entrepreneurs, people opening new restaurants, all sorts of different outcomes. And in some ways that might be a good thing, right? Because we need entrepreneurs. And even if we have, 90% of entrepreneurs failing in their business, that 10% that succeed could be a big driver of economic growth. And so I think, that's one thing to think about. One of my favorite statistics statistics, of course, is that 90% of drivers believe they are above average, right? Which, of course, is not actually possible. We can't have more than 50% being above average. We also have overexuberance, which I think sometimes is related to brand loyalty, right? Where people have sort of extra enthusiasm for a product, whether you can probably think of maybe brands that you yourself are overly exuberant about, or friends, whether it's Apple or sneakers or cars. People, have that feeling of, overly excited and connected with that brand. Another piece of behavioral economics that's important is this idea of confirmation bias, right? Confirmation bias is the idea that we start with a set of beliefs, right? And we only sort of focus on the pieces of information that support that belief. And we kind of ignore the other pieces. And so, if you are, progressive, liberal, you sort of focus on the pieces of the news that support that view. If you're conservative, you focus on pieces of news that support that view. And part of that is just like, you get happiness from feeling right? I think we all do. But the problem is, of course, if we're not updating our beliefs based on facts, and based on all the facts, right, not just some of the facts, then we can make mistakes, right? And we can also be deceived. And I think that's one of the important things when we think about, advertising, but when also we think about things like, social media, is that if we're all sort of in this sort of confirmation bias bubble, then we can get taken advantage of. And that can be a problem and maybe something that we want to regulate away. But of course, we have to decide sort of how paternalistic we want to be. The last piece that I think that we're going to talk about in this video is this idea of cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is an idea from psychology where, you have one belief over here and then you have information over here that contradicts that belief. And it really makes us unhappy, right? So often what we'll do is we'll just ignore this new information in order to avoid the cognitive dissonance. And again, firms can take advantage of that, right? They can say, oh yeah, well, we'll just ignore that piece of information and take advantage of that. But like hazardous occupations, right? So if you think, okay, I'm working in this job, I like this job pays well, but somebody said, oh, but a lot of people have died. I'd be like, oh no, that's not true. Or, that might be true over there, but it's not true where I work, right? And so you're basically not, you're sort of ignoring that danger. And if you're ignoring it, then you might make mistakes. You might not be as careful as you should be, and that can lead to actual danger for someone. All right, so as I said, in the next video, the last video for chapter 4, we'll talk about loss aversion and some other sort of behavioral aspects that are going to be important. And then we're going to move more towards our IO models starting in chapter 5.